I know. Good morning, everyone. Can we settle down, please, and begin the session? Please take your seats, close the doors, drink the last of your coffee, etc. I must say we feel a bit like a rock band up here because the lights are on us and we can't really see you. So this must be how you two feel when they play in Belgrade Stadium. Let me very quickly introduce myself, the panel, and give you an idea of how we're going to structure this extremely important discussion, which is there an end to this financial crisis, and what way can we get out of it, both economically and, crucially, politically, because all of our solutions have to be democratically legitimate to be sustainable. My name is Hugo Brady. I'm a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform, which is a London-based pro-European think tank, if that's possible. I'm actually the Brussels representative, and we basically think the EU is a very good thing, but could always work better. To my immediate left, we're very kindly joined by the Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration, Suzana Grubješić. Thank God. And then again to the left is Sinan Ulgen, who is the director of EDAM, a very reputable Turkish think tank, and also a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. And then again is Mr. Bruce Jackson, who's going to introduce himself later. So, if I can just make some very brief introductory remarks about the economic crisis. Economists like to say that there's a joke amongst economists that there's 4 different types of economy. There's developing, there's developed, Japan, and Argentina. And I think that by the end of the Eurozone crisis, which we have seen fluctuate dramatically over the last few months, and which really does dictate the economic future of Europe and probably the future of globalization in many ways. I was speaking to a few representatives of the Shanghai Institute for International Affairs during the week, and the Eurozone crisis is the lead chip in the global political game, because it affects, although Europe itself is not making the political weather, what happens in Europe happens to the global economy, and therefore everybody cares about it. Since the intervention of the European Central Bank a few weeks ago, we've seen the yields on bonds, such as the Irish bonds, for example, the country I know best, have come down very, very dramatically. But at the same time, countries like Portugal and Greece seem to be slipping deeper and deeper into trouble, so nobody can figure out what's going to happen. So I think we haven't seen the end of this drama, and we need to discuss it in depth during this session. Our panelists have all very kindly agreed to limit themselves to 7 minutes, and then we will take some questions from the floor. So can I hand the floor now to the Minister? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brady, and I would also like to express my gratitude to the organizers, my dear friends, Ms. Sonja Licht, Maja Bobic from European Movement of Serbia, the organization from which I originally came from, and the politics from the European Movement of Serbia. So it is really a challenging topic. Is there an exit out of the European crisis of economy and democracy? But I would not speak only about economic crisis, because it's not only about economy. There are some other crises as well, some other deficits as well. What is really threatening the stability of Europe today? Though seemingly different in roots and manifestations, crises of economy and democratic deficits in the EU are closely interconnected. Arguably, to a large extent, the current predicament could be attributed to a lacking or defunct democratic procedures which impeded timely and effective actions of both the EU institutions and respective governments of member states amid the looming debt crisis. At the same time, the growing dissatisfaction and economic hardship accompanied by necessary but painful austerity measures, coupled with populist rhetoric coming from extremes on both sides of the political spectrum, left and right, challenged in a new way our democratic institutions. Struggling EU nations are facing 2 kinds of deficits. Budgetary deficits, which deteriorate foundations of European economies, and democratic deficits, which undermine the social cornerstone of the European project. In economic terms, there is a clear trade-off between the two. It is not realistic to expect that swiftly and often hastily implemented reforms, though aimed at solidifying economic systems in dire need of restructuring, would leave the system of values for which Europe has fought over many decades intact. There is no simple way out of this crisis, but there clearly is a starting point, and that is the European Union and more of it. The EU enlargement has been one of the few success stories of the EU, proving the tremendous capacity of the Union to transform societies with its structural foreign policy. Even when at the times when countries of the so-called New Europe were passing through institutional crises, as it was recently the case with Hungary and Romania, for example, the EU proved its capacity to restore the rule of law and democracy. Nevertheless, the concept of enlargement suffered even before the recession started in 2008, and we were all presented with notions of the enlargement fatigue and absorption capacity. In today's reality of growing financial uncertainty and economic challenges, accompanied by perpetual questioning of decisions made in the past, it is only normal that skepticism towards accepting new member states, often regarded as additional fiscal burden, has re-emerged. At the same time, for everything I've mentioned so far, it is now more than ever important to show commitment to the European project and its inherent values. This commitment must be equally shared by the EU and its member states and by the aspiring candidate countries. EU officials have reportedly underlined that the future of the Western Balkans lie within the EU as long as they manage to fulfill the membership criteria. Countries of the region have displayed a commendable level of commitment to reforms and harmonization with EU standards. Serbian government, on its part, is profoundly devoted to the country's EU future and dedicated to reforms which will primarily benefit the citizens of Serbia. And that is the crucial point for me personally. EU membership is not, cannot, and should not be the goal in itself. It should be a normal and logical consequence of a real and substantial transformation of the society. In this respect, the process of EU enlargement is indispensable, providing not only sets of reforms and best practices proven to be effective in European countries, codified in the acquis communautaire, but also a time frame and clear benchmarks for their implementation. However, communicating the EU and the process of integration has been a challenge throughout the region, not only in Serbia, with shortcomings both on the part of national authorities and the EU officials alike. On one hand, national leaders were presenting unrealistic scenarios of prompt EU accession and bidding with random dates, while at the same time blaming the EU for every unpopular but necessary reform. On the other hand, EU missed countless opportunities to properly communicate concrete benefits of the EU-sponsored projects and programs. That is why it is now in times when popular support for the enlargement, both in the EU member states and the candidate countries, is rather unimpressive. Our responsibility as politicians is to be honest and consistent without sugarcoating the truth and without changing the rules of the game as we go. Serbian government is committed to reforms which lead to fulfilling legal, political, economic criteria for the EU accession and ultimately better life of our citizens, as well as healthy and positive relations with our neighbors and proactive participation in all regional fora. At the same time, Serbian citizens expect the EU to stay true to their commitments and appropriately reward progress made by our state and our society on our predetermined membership path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for ending on that very confident note, Minister Grubješić. If I could now hand the floor to Sinan to talk a little bit further about the economic and political aspects of the crisis.
Thank you, Hugo. I may not be so successful as the minister on ending on a high note, however, and I hope you allow me that liberty at the end. When I received the invitation to attend the forum, I accepted gladly, and I very much would like to thank the organizers. I spent a number of my childhood years in Belgrade, and it's such a nice thing to come back to the city. Then I started to prepare for this event. And the first question that was initially addressed to our panel was about the economics of it. Namely, how do we assess the economic situation in Europe, what it has brought about. And I started to think about not only what has been written about the economic crisis in Europe, and there are large volumes that have been written over it, but really, how do you link the economics of it to the politics of the region? And that's basically what I will try to do. I want to start with how I frame this problem. It's essentially a problem of competitiveness for Europe. And it's a problem of twin competitiveness. One is a competitiveness among the EU or between the EU and the rest of the world. And the other one, and perhaps the more insidious one that we have been blinded to, is a problem of competitiveness between the EU member states, between the North and the South. And we see this clearly with one very visible parameter, and that is the size of the current account deficits. What we have seen after the euro is a burgeoning trade deficit between the North and the South, with the trade balance of the periphery countries moving in the red more and more. So the question that, when an economist looks at the situation, asks is basically how will those southern countries, the periphery countries, regain their competitiveness? Again, not only vis-à-vis the rest of the world, but vis-à-vis the north of Europe, vis-à-vis Germany in particular. And the textbook answer to that, critical question is essentially an exchange rate devaluation, fiscal discipline, and structural reform. That is what you read in the economic textbooks. That is what a number of IMF delegations try to impose across the world to the countries that have witnessed such a loss in competitiveness. Now, for the Eurozone, obviously, one of those conditions or one of those policy instruments is not available. Namely, the Euro countries cannot devalue their currency, so they cannot, through devaluation, regain competitiveness. And therefore, we have to think about other policy measures that will help the type of internal devaluation to evolve. Now, in the past, there are a number of different success stories within the EU. Germany is one. When you look at the German success story, this is a country that has moved in about a decade from a negative current account to a very positive one. Germany today is the largest exporter in the world in absolute terms. And this is mainly due to the reforms, the structural reforms that were undertaken during the Schröder era. Now, Germany may not be a very good blueprint for the countries because it's a large economy, but many of those countries, the periphery countries, Spain, Portugal, Spain to some extent, but Portugal, Greece, are certainly smaller economies. But there are other examples, like Latvia, for instance, which after the severe contraction in 2008 was able to rebound. And there are clear recommendations that come out of these crises. So there are four fundamental factors, recommendations for an internal devaluation to succeed, to pull back a country from a declining competitiveness. I'll name those four, but I will focus on the last one, which was because that's where I think the politics of it are much more interesting. The first one is that the economy in question needs to be small and open. The second one is that it needs to have flexible labor markets. The third one is that it has to have trade partners that do well. And the fourth one is that it needs to be willing to put up with a loss of output and employment. Now, what that means in a more simpler terms is that societies should accept a loss in their real income, a loss in their standard of living. That is the policy prescription for regaining competitiveness. Now, when you stop here and think about what that means in political terms, it essentially means that the countries that today are at the forefront of the economic crisis, the periphery countries, need to be able politically to deal with the consequences of such a difficult outcome. Namely, they need to understand and they need to internalize the fact that their short-term, if not mid-term future will be worse, not to say much worse, than their recent past. What this does is essentially, this is a test about the strength of domestic institutions. And this is a test for the institutions that I will categorize under internal conflict management. I'm not talking here about ethnical conflicts, which is something that we talked about last night in a different panel. This is about internal conflict management, about the distribution of costs in a given society. How are these costs going to be measured? How are they going to be distributed among the different members of society, among the government, among the trade unions, among capital owners, among workers? This is fundamentally how society will be able to deal with this distribution of costs. And there's an interesting literature that sheds light on this. This is a literature that was developed years before on a different topic, which I think is nonetheless very relevant for the topic that we're discussing. Again, harking back to economic theory, there's literature about, this was initial literature developed to understand how societies benefit from trade liberalization. And it essentially came into being in order to allow a better understanding on which countries deal better with globalization, which countries benefited from globalization, and which countries benefited, therefore, by trade liberalization. And the answer that was developed in that literature, particularly by people like Dani Rodrik, was that they were arguing that the countries that benefited from globalization, that benefited from trade liberalization, were the countries that were able to nurture the type of internal conflict management institutions that allowed a society to come to grips and to solve these problems of the distribution of costs. And for countries that had reached this level of institutional maturity, trade liberalization proved to be positively related to growth. And the countries that lacked these institutions, the outcome of trade liberalization was a much more mixed outcome. Now, the analogy with the periphery countries, with the southern countries in Europe that face the burden of adjustment today, I think is very clear. So when you start to peel back the different layers of the economic crisis in Europe today, you find that the inner layer is not about Europe. The inner layer is about the strength and the maturity of the institutions of democratic governance. And this is really a test about the maturity and the strength of these institutions. And I use the term institutions in the large sense. It is about governments. It is about political parties. It is about the media. It's about all the platforms that create the interaction between these different social stakeholders. It is inherently political. It is not economic. There is no technical answer. There is no economic answer to the current crisis that we are facing. It is an inherently political challenge, and we definitely need a political answer. And the second outcome of this analysis, if you are with me, is that Europe in itself and by itself will not be able to provide the answer. it can only provide breathing room. The answer will need to be designed and implemented at the domestic level if we believe that this is really a crisis about institutions. Now, I talked at great length about the burden of adjustment that falls on the southern countries. Now, the northern countries also have to share some of this burden through possibly higher inflation, higher wages, so that they can help this adjustment, this costly adjustment in the south. But fundamentally, and here's where I want to end, is we are facing a race. There's a deadline. There's a deadline for adjustment. It's going to be increasingly difficult for the governments that are now undergoing this crisis to sustain the legitimacy of their system if they cannot start to improve the conditions of their citizens. And this can become a threat to democracy. I think we don't need to go very far down the pages of history to understand how much of a threat this can represent, even in a continent like Europe. I agree with Hugo. I think we certainly have not seen the end of this drama. And we have to look at the real dynamics behind the crisis, try to peel the different layers, and when I peel those different layers, what I face is really a crisis about domestic governance. And this is where we should focus more so than what we can do at the European level.
Thank you very much, Sinan. And I suspect a question we'll come back to later is that a small country like Latvia can make a 17% adjustment, but ask a country like Spain to do that. The larger countries are less manoeuvrable, and therefore the political and democratic questions are even larger. Could I move on to Bruce Jackson now, the president of the Project on Transitional Democracies. Bruce, you'll give us, no doubt, also a transatlantic view on this.
Well, I wouldn't call it a transatlantic view, but the topic is the financial and democratic crisis in Europe, and I think I'm going to argue it is not, that is not what's happening, and I'll just to have some respectability for this argument, I'll cite Ivan Krastev, a great thinker from the region here, who is writing extensively about this. First, I don't think we have a crisis of democracy. I think what's going on in Europe is kind of a political air sickness, which is something that occurs when liberal goals are contradicted by democratic mechanisms. What is happening in Brussels is liberals want to reform the EU with federalism, and the Democrats elsewhere in Europe want to limit federalism in order to free electorates to vote for nationalism, populism, or government by referendum. That is perhaps a contradiction of political imagination, but it is not a failure of European institutions. It may be unpleasant, but it's not a crisis. Secondly, it's hardly a financial crisis. We have always thought that liberalism and capitalism went together and they were intertwined. The last major change in Europe in 1989 brought people who were democratic, anti-communist, and firmly capitalistic into Europe. Today, a Democrat in Greece or Spain or France is probably an anti-capitalist. It's kind of hard to have an integrated European market if you want to be based on anti-capitalist goals. A very strange outcome. But this is really not a financial crisis. A financial crisis is where you can't pay your debts. A financial crisis is not when you don't want to pay your debts or want to have certain conditions in certain banking regimes. It is a discussion of conditions in process, not insolvency. Thirdly, we talk about the disillusion voters have with European democracy, that this is a very great change. It seems to me that the generation that's grown up in Europe has grown up in 60 years of unparalleled prosperity beginning in the immediate post-war up until 2008. We don't have anybody living today that has a political memory of the 1930s. But one should note that disillusionment, depression, even despair is the zeitgeist of any global recession. And we are in a global recession. I don't think the EU caused that. It's possible that the economic conditions themselves caused that. Finally, there's the argument that Europe has, that we are unique. The financial crisis is unique to Europe and these debates are unique to Europe. Well, as an American, that doesn't seem to be true. Americans say that they're disillusioned with their government. Occupy Wall Street rejects capitalism too. The Tea Party rejects the federal government in Washington. Obama supports the federal state, but Romney supports the devolution to member states. It's all about the financial crisis in America and whether we should take money from rich people on Wall Street, which I think you call Germany on this side of the Atlantic, and give it to what Romney unfortunately calls the 47%, bad term, which I think you call either pigs or Southern Europe in this side of the Atlantic. It's the same debate. And so there may be a financial crisis in Europe, but it's not original, and it's not unique to this side of the Atlantic. What I think is going on, is, and particularly important to reinforce and underline in Serbia, the EU remains the most ambitious and largest project in constitutional democracy to occur since the American Revolution 250 years ago. On historical terms, it's been amazingly successful. There's no taking that away from it. What has happened is it has hit its federal moment about 50 years later than we did in our period. It's undoubtedly going to result in greater banking federalism, but not just that. Obviously, there's going to be a federalization of the energy portfolio, which is a $1 trillion project looking Europe in the face. Competition will have to reconcile, and I think what you're seeing in the EADS, BAE discussions is the glimmer of federal approaches towards defense, which may come many years from now. I think where I disagree with Ivan Kresta is I don't think that there's a danger of paralysis or disintegration at the center of the European political experiment. I think it is just as likely that within 2 years the EU and the United States will succeed in negotiating an Atlantic Free Trade Pact, which will create an integrated or free trade market, which will contain 50% of the entire wealth on the face of the planet, which is around $33 trillion annually.
the current measures are acceptable but still not enough, but they are more optimistic that a political solution will be found. And you can sort of hear that in Sinan's remarks. I think that you gave us a great dichotomy between the economic analysis and the political analysis. Fundamentally, I agree with Sinan. The solutions to the crisis do have to be political. And furthermore, they have to be in some way democratically sustainable. Because most people think that some mutualization of debt has to be a part of the eventual solution. The problem with that is that when governments start issuing mutual debt, they are essentially having the same budget, and that requires having the same treasury, and that again requires a political union. None of this would be as serious if the institutions in Brussels were a bit stronger than they perhaps are. The European Commission has lost some authority in recent years and is not really at the centre of actions to manage the crisis. Although by the end of the year, the Europeans will, we think, have agreed a banking union, which the Commission is in charge of designing. So that's given it back some political legitimacy. However, the European Parliament, the only multinational, directly elected parliament in the world, is not a body which would be seen in the rest of Europe as incredibly democratically legitimate, simply because voters' turnout has decreased at every election since direct elections were introduced in 1979. So it's very difficult to see the future of the European Parliament as the democratic answer, the democratic sticking plaster that we're going to put on this solution to this crisis to make it sustainable. Then, of course, you have, and this is the first question I'm going to ask Minister Grubješić, which is, you have countries outside the EU and indeed countries who are not in the euro. What will the solution to this crisis mean for existing EU members and candidate countries who wish to join the euro or perhaps don't until the crisis is resolved? But currently, they will have to make huge changes, much larger than the ones they already have to make for EU membership. These countries will have to basically have a common budgetary policy with the rest of Europe. Well, that's a lot of sovereignty to give up overnight. Countries like Latvia, for example, do intend to join the euro next year. And countries like Poland, the largest and most important of the newer countries, is sort of scratching its head and saying, you know, we do want to join. It's a bit like St. Augustine, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. They do want to join, but of course they're also a bit nervous, and the Germans are putting a lot of pressure on them to join the euro, especially if Greece suddenly leaves the currency. If Greece becomes the first country to leave the currency, economists predict a massive attack on the euro, which could kill it. However, if Poland were to join immediately, you'd have the exit of one country which nobody has much hope for at the moment, and the entry of a fast-growing country which everyone sees a lot of potential for. So there's this big question hanging over us, is what will be the political and economic fallout from the exit of Greece if that happens? Personally, I hope Greece does not end up leaving the Union or leaving the currency. And the last question is the position of Germany in all this. Germany is now for the first time in European history, or in the EU's history, the most important country economically. And it has always basically used its economic policy it's always advanced its economic goals but preferred not to have a foreign policy. We all remember, for example, that the Germans didn't want to play any role in Libya. The Germans don't want an expansive foreign policy. Their history teaches them that when Germany leads, bad things happen to Germany. So how can Germany take a credible role to agree to be a benign hegemon, and how comfortably can it fit into that role? Because as surely as night follows day, that role will involve them developing a greater diplomatic presence in the world, a greater security presence. The two things follow each other. So all of these questions face us at what I believe is the beginning of the most critical phase of the Eurozone crisis. And what happens in the Eurozone will affect all of Europe, and what happens to Europe will affect the world. So on that basis, we begin our discussion. And the first question I would like to address to the Minister would be, how does this look from your perspective, from the outside looking in? Is Euro membership everything that it once was, perhaps for your country, for example?
Well, we are aware here of the consequences of the economic crisis, which has started even before it started officially elsewhere in the world, and the previous and the present government were trying to cope with the effects of the crisis, which were enormous to our economy. And first of all, our standard of living is low. Everybody, especially if you're a politician, should be aware of that fact, that with the average salary of less than 400 euros, You cannot get huge support for some unpopular measures, especially austerity measures, if you are willing to reform the financial sector or to consolidate the fiscal policy in Serbia. What are the consequences of the crisis? Although low level of productivity has become even lower. Unemployment rate, which was high before, now it's even higher. It's around 25%. So it's a huge burden for any government in the world to have 25% unemployment rate within the country. Many structural reforms, and I don't want to sound like an IMF employee, but yes, structural reforms have been left aside, and nobody has dared to dig deep into structural reforms in this country. But sooner or later, this needs to be done. Particularly vulnerable is our pension system, and the wish of all politicians to keep the pensions as high as they are now, at the level of the 70% of an average salary, which in the long run is not sustainable. Everybody knows that that's the basic of economy, but due to political reasons you cannot intervene really with the cuts of pensions and salaries. Instead of freezing them, the government will allow for salaries in public sector and pensions to rise by 2%, but having in mind the inflation rate of over 10%, with likely 12% by the spring next year, the salaries in public sector and pensions will be actually frozen, or will actually decrease. But these are only short-term measures until the end of this year. But the budget deficit is close to 7%, 6.7%. The aim is to reduce it next year to half it, actually, to get to the level of 3.5%, which is ambitious and which will require unpopular measures. It's not about savings and expenditures only, but it's about, as Mr. Ulgen said, it's about the lack of competitiveness of our economy. It's about our low base, low productivity, and it's about our weak public sector and weak private sector. So when you combine these two weaknesses, we get what we have now. The crisis was also an excuse for all the bad that has happened here in economic terms. I thought that the crisis would be used to really do some reforms as a good excuse, but the crisis, on the other hand, was excuse not to do anything. So the crisis is here, and it will stay for a while, I'm pretty sure.
I'd like to use my position as chair just to ask a question briefly to each speaker. Sinan, I would like to pick up on something you said, which was you pointed out how Germany had been the sort of good pupil and had made its own reforms years ago and fixed its own economy, became the exportmeister, became briefly the world's largest exporter. But I think you neglected to mention that Germany itself broke the rules of the euro in order to cushion its own those structural reforms. The problem I see it in the Eurozone crisis is the answer to everything is structural reforms. But structural reforms take 10 years to kick in. What are our voters going to do? Go into cryo-freeze until wake up in a happy 2020. So what do you see is the problem I'm trying to point out here is there's a problem of rules. There has to be some flexibility for the countries who are asking to make such sharp adjustments. So is there an answer there somehow? And if you like, you can either now or later comment on how things look from the Turkish side looking into the EU.
Maybe I'll start with the second part of your question to follow up on the minister's statements, how things look from countries that are negotiating their accession. And there are two dimensions to that. One is that the EU's image has been incredibly tarnished. When I go out in Turkey in public fora, universities, and speak about the EU, already it didn't have a particularly good image because Turks were generally frustrated with the experience with the EU. But now it's, in a way, a relief to some of my citizens saying, look, they were saying no to us, arguing that we were not at the economic standard for joining the EU, and look at what's happening to them. But if you go beyond this, perhaps instinctive reaction, you realize that the EU's image has been greatly handicapped by the economic crisis. EU is seen not so much anymore as part of the solution, but itself part of the problem. And that obviously shapes thinking about EU accession. Many more people are vocal saying, why do we need the EU? Why should we join a sinking ship? Now, I don't particularly believe that the EU is a sinking ship. I think that, the EU will certainly find the solution to this crisis and possibly emerge from this crisis in becoming a stronger entity. We can discuss what sort of EU will emerge, and I think that's also a very interesting discussion. It will not be the EU of your mother. It's not going to be. It's certainly going to be a different EU. We can talk about multi-tier. We can talk about concentric circles. We can talk about the EU without the UK, which may also be a possibility. Hugo, you may want to comment on that one. But nonetheless, this is the prevailing sentiment. And I think it's becoming much more difficult for a government intent, at least paying lip service to EU accession, to push EU-linked reforms in this environment. And I certainly would like to hear your views about how the politics of it play out in Serbia. But that's at least the politics of this or the impact of this crisis on a country like Turkey that is actually negotiating accession. It's becoming increasingly more difficult to convince large segments of the population that EU accession is a good thing for Turkey. That's where we stand. Now, coming back to your question about the economics certainly, what we have seen, the debate evolving in the EU, initially it was very much about austerity. It was very much about enforcing fiscal discipline. It was very much about saving to compensate for the past sins of the southern countries. Now there's a more mature discussion. I think France has had a positive influence in all of this, bringing on board the second dimension, which I think is indispensable, and that is growth. You cannot discuss what's going on within Europe, and you cannot really paint a good future for Europe if you don't discuss prospects for growth. If you just restrain yourself to austerity, the outcome of it will, at least I believe, will be a much more difficult future for all of Europe. So I think the fact of bringing growth into the discussion and basically trying to find a balance between these two possibly competing objectives, austerity and growth, is where we are today. And I think this is this is really the core of the issue. There's no easy answer to it, but I think now the EU institutions at least and Germany with with Merkel moving its position, is at least trying to buy enough time to prevent a degeneration of this crisis, to give enough room for national politicians and for the EU to start to find the answers to this delicate balance between austerity and growth.
Okay, thank you. Those excellent comments, and we'll open up the discussion later beautifully. Bruce, you made some fantastic remarks, which I enjoyed, including the political air sickness, which I wrote down word for word, because I think I'll use that myself at some point. But what I wanted to ask you specifically was, you say that this is not the crisis in the dialogue, the narrative on this crisis just isn't correct in many ways, that people see it as a crisis in our institutions. And I agree with you, the strange inertia of the political centre is directly contradictory to the usual narratives about the rise of the far right in Europe, for example, something that we're obsessed by, and notwithstanding the rise of groups like Golden Dawn in Greece. But if you say that this is not really the existential crisis, or at least not the kind of existential crisis we thought it was, how long do you think the crisis can actually go on like this? Because to my mind, we have national governments who can't do the reforms that they are being pressed to. We have a federal, confederal structure, the EU, which doesn't work the way it should. And in the middle, nothing gets done. So I can't really see how long we can go on like this without something breaking.
That's a difficult question.
Sure.
Look, it seems to me that the rise of the populism and nationalism is a little bit of a confusion between representational democracy and democracy every hour. I mean, that's not what's on offer. Actually, we only get to vote once every 4 years, and then you're stuck with President Obama, from my perspective. It's not something we get to review every day or vote on everything coming out of Brussels or Washington. So that will take political courage for the Europeans to explain. I would like to sort of quibble with your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman. It seems to me that Europeans have a wonderful ability to basically look at things in theory. And if budgets lead to that, leads to central banks, leads to political union, it all happens tomorrow. Yes, well, that's how it works in theory, but that's not how it works in practice. If you look at federalism in the United States, Hamilton was 1789. It took us a century to get to antitrust. We didn't get to social, pensions until another 2 or 3 decades. We finally got to highways in 1958, and we have not yet gotten to health care. So you only federalize what you must federalize. And frankly, it would seem to me that a federalization of Europe is not going to impinge on what most people do in France or Greece anytime in a century. I mean, banking does have to be, and frankly, that's where Hamilton began. I was also struck by the minister's comment, which I think is extremely true, that Serbia and other aspirant countries are non-competitive at the moment, and the further east you go, the more non-competitive they are. But let's just look at, Serbia. Well, I wonder how this happened. Well, we had 4 wars. When I used to come here all the time, every single businessman in Serbia was on a visa ban in the United States. They couldn't get to markets for more than a decade. For the better part of the last 20 years, Serbia has been under some form of containment or isolation from the major markets and institutions and banks of Europe. It seems to me there's a very simple solution to that, which is as rapid as integration as we can into the European market and the Euro-Atlantic market, and an end of any kind of obstruction to the mobility of capital and labor. And I remember when basically there were fines of Austria for Serbian students to basically make it harder for them to study in Europe's universities. All that has to come to an end, and frankly, Minister, this is your portfolio. And so I hope we move as quickly as possible to the starting line of the discussion of European integration.
Okay, I think we've been having a conversation between ourselves for too long now, so let's begin. And if I could ask you, we'll go to the floor. When you speak, if your comment is, or if you're making a question, please address the whole panel if you can. If it's a comment, please keep it to a minute and a half maximum, and please introduce yourself as well. So let me see. There's loads of people. Someone's waving 2 hands over here, so I think that's obviously keen.
Hello. Good. My name is Tim Judah. I'm the Balkans correspondent of The Economist. I think I would like to pick up on something that Sinan has mentioned, but I think it actually deserves quite a lot more serious looking at, which is the possibility of a British exit from the EU. And I'd be interested to hear your opinions on what would be the possible impact. I mean, how would the EU look after a British exit, for example, from Belgrade, from Ankara, from Washington, and maybe you'd like to sort of talk about the possibility of that, and also, since we're about it, the possibility of the dissolution of the UK, with the possibility of Scotland remaining in the EU. How would that look? How would that change the geopolitical map and how it looks from Belgrade, from Ankara, and from Washington? Thank you very much.
Okay, that's one. We'll take a set of three. This gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Dimitar Bechev. I'm the head of the European Council for Foreign Relations office in Sofia. So I'm probably replacing my colleague Ulrike. I just wanted to press the panelists to comment about the impact of the crisis in the Eurozone on this region. Because we have seen how the contagion has come to these geographic latitudes. And through the banking system, I mean, if you just look at the percentage of Greek presence. Also, Slovenia is not doing so greatly in the banking sector. Italian banks you can comment on. And just to be the devil's advocate, isn't it the case that Europe has become part of the problem? I just recently wrote a brief for ECFR playing with this argument. It might not necessarily be so. But this instability that is imported through the turbulence in the Eurozone, what is the fallout on the region and how do we get from here in the Western Balkans?
Thanks. Third question. This lady here.
Hi, my name is Milada Vahudova. I'm a professor of European politics at UNC Chapel Hill. And my question is for Minister Grubješić. I think many of us are wondering if perhaps you could shed some light on how the policies of the current Serbian government towards European integration are different or will be different than the policies of the previous government. Will there be a difference in emphasis, more attention to economic reforms? If you could shed some light on that. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Can we take those questions as they were in order, and the panelists who were directly asked to comment, please. So, Sinan, I guess that's you first.
I'll start with this, fascinating question about the UK exit from Europe. And I'll try to be provocative. You essentially ask me how that would be viewed from, where we stand. Initially, my reaction would be that, if such an eventuality were to occur, that would greatly reduce the EU's ability in many domains. In economic, in trade, in foreign policy, in defense. So it would certainly harm the EU. That would be the initial sort of reaction, looking from outside. But then there's another dimension to the UK exit, which we are starting to elaborate on. And that is what sort of relationship the UK will establish with Europe if it were to leave the EU. And I think the reason why that is an interesting, at this point, philosophical discussion, hoping that it will always remain a philosophical discussion, is that that relationship could indeed be a model for a country like Turkey that has faced a number of political impediments to its accession. In many ways, from that perspective, the relationship that London will establish with Brussels is of enormous interest to us, provided that it is, and we believe that it is going to be a mutually beneficiary relationship. It's not going to be a relationship, cast in membership, but nonetheless trying to think outside the box and see what sort of relationship that will be, what will be the components, what will be its governance structure, whether it's going to be in any way different from the relationship between the European Economic Area countries or Switzerland, which is also incidentally an EEA country, or between the EU and its quote-unquote strategic partners. That exact model, the paradigm of the UK's relationship with Europe, if UK were to exit the EU, would, I think, be a very interesting example for a country like Turkey.
Okay. Does anyone else want to comment on the British question? I can say one word because Sinan told me to. Bruce, you first. No, you first.
Of all the mistakes and sins of American conservatism, we have done nothing to deserve the British Tories. It's not possible for our ally to be as stupid as to leave the European Union. It would undoubtedly create a huge breach with the United States.
Yeah, that's emphatic. Of course, Minister. Yeah.
I was here in the House of Commons and I met not EU skeptics in some Tory MPs, but EU haters. So I was really surprised what I heard from them. And given that my party has good relations with the British Conservative Party, I hope that they're just minor group and that they will not prevail within the Conservative Party itself. But I was really extremely surprised. I came not as a Euro fanatic, but as Euro realist from an aspiring country, candidate country, but I just hated it. So hopefully it will stay on a verbal level.
I think the key question here is what does life in the European Union look like in the future for a non-Euro country? Some two countries have formal opt-outs from the Euro, Britain and Sweden, which is supposed to try and join. But you're seeing this two-tier Europe emerging. One way or the other, I sort of lean towards Sinan's view that it is likely, in fact, probably even desirable, that the 17 Euro countries, 17 plus, do become more tightly integrated in order to secure the future of the common currency. But Britain simply will not be a part of that. So how actually that works out, whether there's going to be this European outer tier, bolstered by the presence of a large, important country like Britain, perhaps that will be better because you have we don't want the outer tier to become this forgotten wasteland. I mean, it has to be a vital part, a vital political organisation. But the issue is who's going to be in it, who will want to stay there, and which countries will choose whether it's safer or not to join the common currency, and how that will develop would the euro area develop its own institutions, its own parliament, its own foreign policy? Would there be a two-tier Europe or two different organisations in the European Union? So it's very difficult to see what will happen. But briefly on the issue of Scottish independence, I mean, I honestly find it hard to believe that the Scottish will ever actually go as far as leaving the UK, and I certainly find it hard to believe that they'll swap one unsuitable currency union, which is the pound, for another unsuitable currency union, which is the euro, because they're so inextricably linked with the rest of Britain. But perhaps I don't have a right to comment on that because I'm actually Irish. So, the next question we have to take is Dimitri's question as to the impact of the euro crisis on this region, because I imagine, and it's a very good point, because you need your trading partner to be growing fast for you to grow fast. So, perhaps, Minister, I could ask you to field that one.
Yes, I said what's the impact to Serbia? This goes as well to other countries in the region. More or less, we are, with the exception maybe of more advanced Croatia, but the rest of us, we are basically in the same pot. We really feel the hardships of economic crisis. And we don't see that we can ourselves pull from the crisis, that we can pull from the crisis by ourselves without an outside help. Yes, this is 2012 years, but we still need this not aid, but rather, how could I call it, cooperation with or assistance from the outside to cope with the crisis. And Serbia has the surplus in trade with the countries in region only. That goes as an argument for our low competitiveness. We cannot export much elsewhere, but within the region, within the CEFTA, We have surplus in trade with our neighbors, with former Yugoslav republics and few other countries as well. But as a region, Southeast Europe was hit hard, really, by the crisis. So I don't have a recipe for the exit. Not yet.
Bruce, do you have a comment?
On this the question of these non-competitive economies coming into the EU, it turns out that a lot of the EU effects come before membership, once you just signal membership. The real estate prices in Croatia and, say, Dubrovnik went up 1,000% in the decade before they came in. All the deals for U.S. Steel, et cetera, in Slovakia came in anticipation. So you get a jobs effect, a labor mobility effect. In sort of DCFTA, which is a sort of a small sliver of EU that's being offered to the Eastern partners, that affects industries very early on. More advanced things that would occur in a currency environment are certainly delayed effects, and some of them you don't want too early because they'll be disruptive and could destabilize. I mean, if you compete directly against Daimler in making cars, you're not going to win. And so you do need some protections to avoid labor dislocations and loss of businesses. But by and large, the problem with Croatia is they got almost all the benefits of the EU before they even got in. So I don't think that that's a big worry, that we'll see a lot of the good things come in advance in the 10 years of negotiation, and those really long poles in the tent are well in the future.
Of course, yes. And also the next question is to you as well. So
the banking sector in Serbia proved to be solid and stable during the crisis. We didn't have any banks closed or savings withdrawn from the banks. We didn't have any bailouts until recently, unfortunately. So you are all familiar with the case of Agrobanka, which has collapsed, and the consequences of its collapse are now visible more than it was visible before. But that proves that one reform in our country was done correctly, the reform of the banking sector, at least.
Sinan, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, a few things to Dimo's question. Dimo, I think that on the banking side, if I have to start there, the worst has been staved off. Namely, what we were fearing initially was that with the financial crisis in Europe, there would be a decapitalization of the branches in the Western Balkans, leading to a credit crunch in the markets. That hasn't happened. So I think we are on more solid ground there. However, going forward, and we discussed this in terms of the impact on the Eurozone, but a Grexit, which is the Greek exit from the Euro, would have significant negative consequences for the economies of this region. And the reason is that with such an event occurring, the most likely reaction globally will be an increase in risk aversion, a severe shortfall in financial flows, a rise in the cost of capital, and all of these markets, all of these states need capital to grow. And some of the growth models are actually predicated on the availability of cheap international capital. So if a Greek exit from Euro to occur, depending on how long it would take for international markets to come back to their level of risk before a Greek exit, this would have enormous consequences and negative consequences for the economies of the region.
Anybody else want to make a comment? Because I'm afraid we're going to have to close in a few minutes. Yeah. In fact, I'm a great believer in keeping on time, and this session actually started a half an hour later than it was supposed to. So we've run out of time. But I have been asked to announce a lunch hour discussion called Mission Possible: How can a civil society organization influence SSR in a country in transition, which will be held in the Kelmegden room. And on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, one of the co-founders and organisers of the BSF. BSF will host an informal panel on how to use the Serbian experience in addressing challenges that civil society faces in addressing SSR in other democratising and post-conflict countries. So I guess that's like the policy version of going to a matinee for lunch. I'd like to thank our panel very much for, I thought, it was a really intelligent discussion. Of course, impossible to fully encapsulate those questions in an hour, but I certainly learned a lot, and it was a great pleasure to hear you and to moderate you, and also to have some questions from the floor. I'm sure the discussion will continue throughout the course of the day. So please give the panel a round of applause. And enjoy your lunch.